my actual scholarly opinion is that as soon as you deploy, isolation, like high exit costs, like really, really apply. And so that's why I believe, like, by definition, you are going to have a cultic experience. And I think what's left is for us to figure out, like, what that tells us and just how cultic the experience needs to be.
The military, how it is different than a cult. It has a lot of the characteristics. It will make you somebody that is different from when you entered. Hopefully that's a good thing. I know a lot of people that leave military service, they look back and they miss it. Ultimately, the military will send you packing, where a cult wants to literally work you until the day you die.
Hey, my name is Shalise Ansola, and this is Cults to Consciousness, where we discuss leaving high-demand religions or organizations and finding healing and independence through awareness and true individual sovereignty. If you're only listening on one of those podcast apps and you want to see all three of our faces, go to our YouTube channel at Cults to Consciousness, where you can like, subscribe, become an advocate, a supporter for people who are coming on and bravely sharing their stories. It means so much, and remember, they are real people. They do read the comments, so we love to see those words of encouragement down below. After all of that, I can't believe I made it through. This is my first interview in like 2 months. First interview recording. We're back in real time. I'm no longer pregnant. It's amazing. My daughter's great. Everyone's great. I'm just very sleep deprived. So we're just going to see how this translates today. But I'm really excited because I'm joined by 2 former guests who are awesome, and they have a lot to say about, is the military actually a cult? We have someone who is currently active military, former military. They were both from 2 different cults, one being Scientology, one being the Children of God. And they both have episodes on our channel, so you can go back and watch them. We'll link them in the description. You don't have to watch those first in order to enjoy this one, but I definitely recommend going back and doing so. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us. We have Mike Brown and Daniella Mestenek-Young.
Thanks for having me back.
Also, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we came across this idea because during Mike's interview, we were talking about the military and how it might be a cult. And we brought up Daniella, and he's like, oh, I know Daniella. I've done interviews with the same people, and I've read her book. And I thought it would be so interesting to get both of you on here together to talk about your differing opinions, because I think there's a lot of overlap, and then there's a lot of differing of opinions. And so I'm excited to get to those. And I think first we need to talk a little bit about your background. So whoever wants to start, we'll just give a brief introduction of the cults you came from, a little bit about your story, and then we'll get into how you both got into the military.
Great. Daniella, you want to kick it off?
I'll start. Thank you. So I am Daniella. I style myself a scholar of cults, extreme groups, and extremely bad leadership. And I grew up in the Children of God, which the shortest way to explain it was a cult that started out supposedly about love, faith, and Jesus, but ended with religious prostitution, pedophilia for God, and preparing for the apocalypse. Mm-hmm. Pretty much as extreme as you can get. When I was 15, I got pushed out of there and into the real world. So I got an education, and then I decided to commission into the military, which was a whole experience for me. I've written a book about that called Uncultured, and it's also on audio.
Highly recommend.
Thank you. And I also got a degree from the Harvard Extension School in organizational psychology. So I can talk about cults from the academic side, from the personal experience side, and even from the military side.
Yes. And I love everything you put out on social media. You're always just like going to town on different groups, and it's so funny and awesome. You're so blunt and straightforward, and I love it. And you're always knitting. So if you guys can hear that clickety click, because she's knitting without even looking, it's pretty brilliant. So Mike, let's hear about a bit about your background and why you're here today.
The short story, I had grown up and my parents got involved in Scientology when I was about 7 years old. My father was a former Marine in Vietnam and very much romanticized military culture and life for me the entire time I was growing up. They got involved in Scientology, and then when their marriage ended up splitting up a couple years later, my mother took me, moved to California, and we joined the Sea Organization. I say we joined. She joined the organization, and I was more or less trafficked into it as a 10-year-old child and deprived of a normal education and very much just educated on what that cult wants its children to be educated in order to make them future executives or to work for the organization, which is a common theme in most high control organizations, definitely in cults, is child labor was definitely a thing. She worked for the Miscavige family, one of the leader's brother, for many years, and I grew up with a lot of my contemporaries being the children of the highest level leadership, either Hubbard's descendants or the Miscavige family. I always say that the cult is like a Game of Thrones, and I was just sort of like one of the sub characters in that entire thing. Is very much how my whole life felt. So I wanted to leave when I was young, and I was forced to stay when I was 15. After I was put in almost like a concentration camp sort of profile in order to keep me from leaving. And by the time I was 18 years old, with barely a GED, I had no other options and decided to stay. I then stayed there, worked there for their highest level organizations until I was about 27 years old, at which time, through all sorts of very unfortunate events, decided to leave. And you have to escape from this organization. It's not an easy way out. You kind of have to drop everything, sneak away so that they don't try to recover you. Left, was able to reconnect with my father, who I had been out of contact with for a number of years, and then ultimately decided to join the military. I wanted to join the military when I was young, when I was 15 years old, and was not able to. So for me, joining the military was sort of getting my life back on at least a track that was of my own decision, of my own choosing, even though a lot of the things in the military, you kind of sign those rights over and you become part of a larger machine. But for me, it was military life, and the mental struggles in the military were easier than the life I had come from, even though the physical requirements in some ways were much more. It was actually, for me, looking back, it almost seemed like it was the easy button for what I was used to. And since then, I went and I did a deployment or two. I decided to apply for a flight training program. What's funny is Daniella's husband and I went through flight school at the same time. We both fly the similar helicopter, both the Chinook, and we've kind of had parallel careers. I am still in training the next generation of pilots. That's kind of the point that I'm at now, being in for 20 years. And I had originally found out about Daniella, and then kind of figured out that, like, hey, she's married to Tom. I know Tom. We went to flight school together, Tom. When I watched her interview with Stephen Hassan, and she was having a discussion about it, and a lot of her comments seemed like, well, she has a bit of a beef with the military. And my initial thought was like, I don't know that I agree with everything she says. I think she's full of crap. So I'm like, well, before I complain to her, I should probably read her book. And I did. And then after I read her book, I had quite a different viewpoint. And I think that that's going to be a bit important to talk about, because though my experiences were very different than hers, I cannot disagree with her conclusions. We come from similar but very different backgrounds. We went through almost identical paths in the military, slightly different. She was a commissioned officer. I was a warrant officer, but she was in an aviation unit working. She would have been somebody that I actually have gone back and forth between two units, one of which was the unit she was in. We were both in Afghanistan at the same time. She was in Kandahar. I was in either Bagram or Jalalabad during the same time. I got shot down the year that her husband, I think, got shot with an RPG as well. So we had like a lot of things going on similarly at the same time in our lives. We just never crossed paths, though we were in the same spheres the entire way through. So I'm really excited about this discussion because of the interesting parallels that we have, and how we have slightly different conclusions about the positive or negative effects on us personally. Mm-hmm. Though I think the experience, we're going to probably come to a lot of agreements like, oh yeah, like all of these characteristics of what we're talking about, the military is super culty. One might argue that it needs to be in certain ways, but there's vast rooms for improvement. And maybe that's some of what we'll talk about a little.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's so interesting. And I guess, Danielle, did you have something you wanted to add before we move on?
So two things real quick. It's like, I don't think the debate is whether the military is a cult or not. I think we agree on that. It's just like the different distinctions of what that means. I think the debate is on good cult or not. But one of the things that's really special to me about this conversation is that, I started deconstructing when I was 22. As soon as I was a lieutenant in the Army and I was safe, I sit down and Google Children of God cult, and then I start reading everything I can find. And then I start branching out to like the Mormons, the FLDS, right? And I'm in my head realizing that Christianity is the problem. Right. And it wasn't until I read Jenna Miscavige's book about Scientology and literally recognized my childhood, that child labor. Cults are always about labor. Finding that out really changed my perspective too. And when I read her book, I was like, oh, Christianity is not the problem, right? The problem is this larger trend, which is coercive control, right? Group coercive control. And that's why, like, I pretty much know any cult survivor, like, we are having the same story, different details.
Yeah. And I definitely want to, as we're going through this, if either one of you says something, I would love the other one to be like, oh, that was same for me, because I love drawing the parallels, especially between cults, and having two people from two different cults is something we've never done before on this channel. So I love drawing those comparisons. So please feel free to do that. I think where I would love to start, though, is you had said, Mike, that going into the military was like hitting the easy button. You're like, oh, I got this. And I remember in Daniella's book, when she's in basic training, holding the bag over her head, thinking, oh, this is a cult, I got this. And so I would love to talk about your first impressions when you both went into the military and the similarities that you were drawing already from your previous backgrounds, realizing that this is something you were totally capable of because of your past.
Right. So I know for me, the indoctrination and the lifestyle in Scientology and in the Sea organization when I worked there, it is at a level that you're only going to have the operational tempo, like the way we refer to that in the military, how hard you are working, the military is only like that when you're in extreme, like actual combat situations or prepping for a real mission and doing that stuff. Then you will have this continuous mission execution mode where everyone is all in all the time, around the clock, anything like your individual person doesn't matter that much. And it's all about the mission. So that was the day-to-day in Scientology and in the Sea organization for the majority of my time. And I maybe had 5% of my own time and my own thoughts available to me. And I was never able to share those thoughts externally. So going into the military, you have periods of work and periods of rest. It's actually quite a bit physically in terms of the schedule on the day-to-day, much easier. And it's not as tightly controlled on what exactly are you doing with your time and how do you account for every little bit. And are you a benefit to, like, in every moment of every thought? Another thing in the culture of the military that is alive and well is people complain. It's almost to a point of, I've heard, like, hey, if people aren't bitching, there might be a problem, because when people stop complaining and just get quiet, then you're like, uh-oh, something might really be wrong. In Scientology, no one was ever allowed to ever complain about anything. You always had to put on this fake facade of it is all okay. That's like this fake happiness, or else you are then investigated as something wrong with you because you're having bad thoughts. It's like 1984, the thought police, bad thoughts, bad thoughts. That is the kind of mentality that was all the time in my life. So going into boot camp, they have like these little, almost like symbolic leadership positions as you're going through boot camp. I kind of found myself at the top of that thing, being the little platoon guide, which is their top level cadet, or not really cadet, but, boot camp leadership person in charge of the other people below me, because I was willing to just put myself out there that much. And it manifested itself as leadership, but really it was almost fanatical addiction to work. And it made it easy for me to do that because the military was asking less of me than what I was giving. So, and I even irritated people. Like, I'd be like, hey, we're just going to stand here at attention when everyone else is sitting around. I'm like, no, we're going to do it better and harder, because that's the mentality I came from. I thought that would mean success for me. Well, the drill sergeants love that shit, but the people around me didn't necessarily.
Yeah.
I was culty moving into the cult the cult mindset of kind of the indoctrination of what occurs in boot camp. And they really break you down psychologically. And I know Daniella have a lot to say about this, but you get people from all walks of life that come in, and they have all different backgrounds. You're going to have privileged pretty boys. You're going to have gang members. You're going to have country boys. You're going to have people that are from the ghetto, the inner city. Like, everyone comes together. Everyone gets their head shaved or their hair pulled back into a bun, and you get yelled at, and you don't have personal thoughts and experiences, you're not allowed to say things unless, like, all of your freedom's taken away and they mold you into what they want you to be.
Right. Loss of identity.
And I know why they do that, because they're trying to get everyone to a baseline to then move forward. And like, if they say, hey, jump on the wire and everyone's going to run across your back and you're a casualty so that the war can win, like getting you into the mindset of sacrificing yourself. I already came from the idea that I was sacrificing myself. This lifetime didn't matter. The bigger mission of the universe was more important, and we live lifetime after lifetime. So the military was easy for me from a mindset perspective. I was out of shape and that was hard, but that's an easy fix in comparison to the mental part.
Sure. Daniella?
Oh, you said so many important things. I hope I can remember half of them. So definitely similar experiences and also some different things for me. I have found since writing my book. So same concept, right? I was born a soldier, and there's a picture of me at the age of 2 dressed up like a soldier of love for Jesus. And it was exactly that mindset. And I have found that it's very common to go from high control group as a child into the military. And across the board, we say this, right? Like it was easier. It was easier than what I grew up with as a child. And by the way, those teenage prison camps they sent to you, important part of sending you through the identity breaking indoctrination. And so many cults have figured this out, the troubled teen industry for evangelicals, right? And so when I first read a book about the troubled teen industry, it was so interesting. It's called Jesus Land. And I was like, I'm relating to it from my cult side, and I'm relating to it from my Army basic training side. But Army basic training is much more humane than those, for sure. I even saw this in Prince Harry's book, right? Going from royal family to soldier, easy, right? And part of it is, again, that op tempo, right? And I always used to say, like, when you're back home, it's something, but then when you go away together, it is like you're going to have a cultic experience. And now, like, my actual scholarly opinion is that when the military is billeting you, when they are paying for your food and telling you where to sleep, you are separated from the world. You're at this very high op tempo, and you are going to have a cultic experience. And I think what's left is for us to figure out like what that tells us and just how cultic the experience needs to be. I will also say, though, to Mike's op tempo, that for me, so first of all, pilots get the most rest because they have to. So for me, joining as a young commissioned officer in the height of the surge, 2009 in Afghanistan, it did not feel like the op tempo dipped that much. But also same thing for me, right? Wasn't in shape, literally quit chain smoking to get myself in shape to join the Army. And I became kind of the super runner, which is a thing the Army cares about. As an Army officer, the number one thing you can do to be successful in that group is be skinny and run fast. And my husband, who Mike knows, says like it was never his skill at piloting. And he's a very, very good pilot. He retired out of the special operations. His skill at piloting was never more important than the fact that he was skinny and he could run fast. And what I try to explain to people who read my book, and they're like, how were you just so physically fit? Like, I wasn't. I was just going to throw myself at that pavement until I was number one. I'm also really good at holding my breath because of trauma. But I promise you, if getting 100% on chemistry tests had been what you needed to do to be a good officer, I would have figured it out. And, for example, I got 100% on the call for fire test in officer school, which is complicated math that I do not understand how to do. And in fact, this pissed my colleagues off because they were like, she doesn't even know how to understand it. It's like, nope, but I know how to game tests and how to be number one. And so that level of perfectionism, first of all, so harmful. I now say that perfectionism was my heroin addiction, but it absolutely comes from that, right? You're growing up, you're an apocalypse child, right? Like you're growing up to die. You're already expected to be willing to sacrifice yourself. And I think one of the things that comes out of growing up in that environment is exactly what you said, that when I realized, oh, I just joined another cult, I was like, be better at it than these suckers. The whole time they're complaining about lack of privacy. Like, I think that's the number one thing that really breaks people. Meanwhile, I'm like, never went anywhere alone till I snuck out of a cult at 15, never even had my own private bed until I was in college, So checking out of privacy for 3 months, that is like no chip off my shoulder.
Yeah. So I think something that we need to discuss, the obvious, which is male versus female experience in the military. There is a huge underlying tone or current or theme, I guess you could say, in your book, Daniella, about the rape culture and how difficult it is to be a female in the military. And I think I've heard you say on your channels before, your Instagram, that if you disagree and you're in the military, it's either because you were blind to it because you were such a great guy, or you were part of the problem. So I want to get your opinion on this too, Mike, as far as, did you see this also going on? What is your opinion on Daniella's take on her book on this?
Could I just say something first?
Go ahead, please.
Because it's gonna lead into whatever you're saying to Mike. That literally part of why I wrote this book was to show the good men what was happening.
Yeah.
But also a thing that I have learned, that anytime you're operating in a system not made for you, it's more traumatizing. Back to you, Mike.
Okay, cool. I think the first thing that I've noticed is that the military is a very male-dominated field, regardless of the service that you're in, or across all services. As you get closer to where the combat is happening, that gets even more so. So as you have more service support positions, more, stuff that is a little bit further away from the direct fighting, you're going to have less females. A few exceptions to that are some of the special operations units that need females as part of their support package. And then also for aviation, you have a lot of females that are in aviation. You don't have as many. It's still male dominated very, very much. So with a male dominated field, you have the military industrial complex that is going to try to do everything to make as much money as possible and spend as little money as possible on what they make. So with that, like Daniella had talked a lot about the kind of gear that is made, like the body armor that women wear. If they get shot wearing male body armor because it is not actually going to fit your torso properly just due to your genetics, the way your body is shaped, you're going to get this, like it's going to physically transfer all of that kinetic energy into your body, and you're going to probably die just from the impact of a bullet hitting the body armor with a big gap in between it, just because of your chest. That's physics. So that's an example on a very, just a rudimentary way that things are designed that don't necessarily take that into account, with the fact that you have a mixed gender population. So with that, you're now going to, like Danielle was talking about, when we go into a cult experience in the military. So for that, what you're going to have is when we go do big training exercises where we all get together and we go and live in tents and we play war games and all that. We do that at a couple different training centers across the country. Or when we deploy. When you deploy, you're fully invested in that. You're living there, you're working there, you're sleeping there, you're eating there, everything. You're geographically separated from everyone. And the same when we go into these training events. Well, when that happens, you're actually controlling people, but at the same time, you have this variance of people, and all people have problems. You're going to have a variation of types of people that are then put in these situations where they're not only geographically separated from their normal life, but they're now in an area where they have access to people they wouldn't normally have. And at the same time, they don't have the same things that they might be using to cope. So if there's people that have psychological issues and they have some sort of dependency issues, you can't have things like alcohol. You're away from your spouse, your significant other. If there's people that have issues, that is going to manifest itself in these tightly controlled situations because you're stuffing everyone together.
Yeah, that makes sense. So that is something that you did notice in the military in your time there.
I did. So there's lots of work that I guess the larger military is trying to do to increase awareness, to make sure that people understand what they're supposed to do. There are processes in place if these things happen, on the ways to prevent it, the way to notice it. Though, if you see something happening, like advocate for, your fellow battle buddy. But it does really depend on good people doing the right thing at the right time, and then people knowing that they could speak up and say something. And then you have also a lot of variation between chains of command that are both good and a lot of chains of command that are not good. And a lot of that will then affect the soldier, individual person, if they do need to report something, are they comfortable with doing that? So there's so many factors that go into this. I think the military is trying to do better. And I think that we have a lot of room still for improvement. But one massive distinction between the military culture is there is a process as opposed to the cult that I came from. There is no process in Scientology. If you have a complaint, if you have been sexually harassed, assaulted, there is no recourse at all. There is no process for it. And that is one distinction.
Yes. And also the military is definitely the cult that pays the most benefits. But one of the things I told Stephen Hassan about his concept that if there's a process, it's less culty, is that the process doesn't work for the females. Which I also want to say kind of in response, hard agree with everything you said, Mike. But I would add that I think it's not just a male-dominated organization. It is actually a misogynistic organization, right? It's actually a woman-hating organization. And it needs really deep change. And so example is Mike referring to me as a female, right? That is dehumanizing language. It makes me cringe. We're trying to get rid of it. But I knew that was going to happen because it would be absolutely unimaginable for him to not use the language of the high control group that he is in right now. And so the change has to come from a systemic level. So the army, I don't even want to mention right now because of politics, but there has been a major world army that recently gave the order, stop using the term female. Female is usually an adjective. We are nouns. If they are your men, we are your women. And this goes all the way through. Like it pulls so importantly through what Mike was talking about the things made for us, right? And there are these very big things that need to change. One is a deep understanding that we are not asking, are women good enough to be men? Because in doing that, we are just breaking the women, right? What we need to understand is women and men both bring different things to combat. And that when men and women are trying to kill you, it makes a lot of sense to have men and women both trying to keep you alive. And one of the things about going into this misogynistic environment is we don't have weapons, armor, equipment, or uniforms that are made for us, right? And even something as silly as a uniform. The Army is all about how good you look in uniform. And so when we don't have uniforms that literally are made for our body ratios, it was impossible for me to wear a uniform that I didn't get critiqued as either clown pajamas or why are you trying to be sexy? Just because we don't fit. With the equipment, with the weapons, they come off. Guys like Mike and my husband Tom will come away from an encounter, probably a combat encounter, thinking she's not a good soldier. I mean, you should hear the way they talk about Jessica Lynch. I talk about it in Uncultured. But the problem is not, I'm not a good soldier. The problem is you have a weapon made for a 6-foot person, and I don't have a weapon made for a 5-foot person. And so all of these things, and then the armor for obvious reasons that I tell in the book, that's all important. And what's really important here and how it ties to the rape culture is when we really understand that a military's job is to program people to conduct violence on behalf of state. And we also understand group norms and how in a high control group, your number one job is not to stand out. And from day one, I stand out, right? He gets his head shaved. I do not. From day one, women are othered. Other becomes enemy very quickly in these high control environments. And in the U.S. Army, our job is to find, fix, and finish the enemy. And I would also say the U.S. is a very gender policing organization, though I do think they're probably getting better on that. But, people, the hair thing, right? Everyone's like, easy, shave the women's heads. That was actually illegal until 2 years ago. And as someone who joined the military with a pixie cut, which was completely in the regulations, you're not being a proper woman. Like, you're still going to feel it. So in a lot of these things, it's like these seems like little things, but there's no way to win. And the process of fighting back doesn't almost ever work for us because we are the demographic that is the least in power.
Mm-hmm. Do you have anything to add to that, Mike?
So if I can at least offer a good news story from my last deployment, which would have been in 2019. We were in Afghanistan, and we work very closely with our intelligence section, all the pilots. You sit down with the intel people and you actually select your landing zones. And our intelligence person that's in charge of our geospatial recognition, GeoInt, she was amazing. I would fight, if I had to, anything that I could to keep her, because she was so good at her job, in that position. And like we complained to the top if anyone was going to move her away and send her to another posting or position or base, because we needed her so much. So we had a very close relationship, her and all the pilots, with everybody in this little compound where we were. And one day, this compound was a soft compound, and it was actually, the security was provided by contractors. So the contractors that were there, because you don't have enough soldiers to actually handle that base defense. Well, the intelligence officer, she came to us and one of the pilots, and she mentioned that there was a contractor that had been harassing her every time she goes to the gym and had been propositioning her and trying to get her to sleep with him. And she didn't like this guy, and he kept following her around. So she came and told one of us because she felt safe with us. She worked with us. We were like family. She was like a sister, and we were like brothers. And that was the sort of feeling everyone had. We're there to protect each other. So she mentioned it to us. Then the pilot came and mentioned it to me because I was the head pilot there. I walked right over to the commander and the sergeant major of the special operations force, and I told them exactly what it was. It was at dinner. They literally dropped their food, walked outside and said, could you please ask her to come to the office? And she came over to the office, and they, said, hey, would you like me to stay with, like Mike Brown to stay with you? And she's like, yes, please. So I said, whatever you're willing to tell us, go ahead and say it. So she told them what she told me. They pulled him out, put him under guard, and had him on the next plane out of that base. And until he was gone, had someone escorting her the entire time to make sure that she wasn't messed with.
Wow.
And we're also working in a very high level organization at that point. But I felt that was progress. I felt that was like, this person can come and feel safe enough to say, I don't feel safe, is safe with the people around her to say, hey, do you have my back? And us saying, you are more important, because we were flying a mission that night. We put all that aside and said, we need to deal with this right now. And it can't wait until later. And it was handled properly. And I felt good about that, because I felt like not only was she safe, but I felt good because she felt safe with us to come and tell us that. That's because we had a habitual relationship, working with people. It's people working with people. And sometimes that's hard in the military because you become a cog in the machine. And sometimes it's just, I'm this job working with this other job, and everyone's expected to do their job. And the personal touch is one of the first things that gets lost. But we had it there, and it worked to our benefit. I don't know how you synthesize that on a large scale, but it worked that time.
Right.
So I felt good. It was like, yay. But I know that's a good news story. And I could probably come up with 12 bad news stories. But I just know that individual action is probably the only difference there in between that and some other stuff. Danielle, I know you want to say something.
Can I jump in real quick before you say something, Daniela?
Yes.
Because I just want to throw in my perspective on this, which is, after all of the cult interviews that I've conducted, it seems like within any cult, there are going to be good people who do follow the rules correctly. And then there's going to be the people who use the rules to their advantage to twist them and find loopholes and demonize the people who try to use the system that was put in place to protect them. And so I love that you're telling this good news story and how the system worked in that capacity. And I want to get Daniella's opinion, because I know from her book saying that people who do come forward and try to speak out end up getting some sort of retaliation against them. And so when we're talking of systems versus people, I think in your case, Mike, the people situation worked out perfectly because everyone was on board with helping this woman, versus in other situations where someone does try to follow the rules, the system that was put in place, but the people just aren't on board with that. And I wonder if that is because of the misogynistic view that is permeating through the military. And so I know, Daniella, you have something to say, so I just want to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that is both a good example of what we are trying to do, but it also shows us like where the systemic change has to come from. And I'll start with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
The system has to understand that the individuals matter as much as the overall group, right? And that's what the army has been terrible at, right? The army song literally says, and the army goes rolling along, right? Anyone's son will do. What happened here, and what I talk about in my book, is like, yes, when you get to that feeling of brotherhood, of sisterhood, that's what we're supposed to be going for. But that is what, until recently, we have been held out of, right? So in my day, over a decade ago, as I talk about in Uncultured, like I'm being sent out as one of the only women on patrol, and I'm being told to watch my back, right? So in the culture of the U.S. Army, at least until recently, I'm supposed to ask Mike to walk me home to keep me safe. But also I have to hope that Mike is going to keep me safe from Mike.
Mm-hmm.
And this affects us. Again, it's not just, oh, this is why women shouldn't be there, right? I have a combat story where I notice something that the men don't notice, and it helps us. And I felt safe to speak up because my leadership had made it clear that they wanted to hear my voice. And so, going to what you were saying about like, this is one example and 12 bad ones, pretty close. And Tom, my husband, actually had to ask me this. He was like, look, I know you're going to hate me for this, but why? Like, why does it seem that the women pilots are worse? And there's so much that goes into that, especially not getting the same training, not getting treated equal, having to, work uphill the whole time. But my biggest answer is stereotype theory. Stereotype theory tells us, first of all, that until you're 20% of the population, your demographic is not addressing subconscious negative stereotypes. So if you pull up a map of what states in America are less than 20% African American. And so for that, I say like leaders, we're just getting to 20% in the military right now. Individual leaders in these individual unit cults are still going to have to understand if you're under 20%, you need to work harder to make sure that your people know these are equal, right? You need to not be making, oh, what about the draft jokes? Because that shows that you just don't think we are equal and we can't do war as well as men. The other part of stereotype theory is it takes 10 good examples to overcome one negative example, right? And so for women, until very recently, we just didn't have the numbers for that. And now like we're finally starting to get to, but it absolutely comes like what came out in his story wasn't our individual unit was great. That's not what stood out to me. What stood out was that the leadership understood that operation wasn't as important as taking care of that individual. And that's how we change it. Like I always say, the military is excellent at preventing fratricide. Excellent. We're so good at it. We just have to see it that way. And we have to understand that it's absolutely unacceptable for him to come back behind the wire and be able to put his weapons down and be safe. And it's not likely for me. But I also, I have been lucky that I worked both on the infantry team, which other than gossiping about me, they were great. They treated me like a sister. And then my second team when I deployed as a captain. And I did have to go to two of my colleagues, my brothers in arms, and say like, this person and this person frighten me. Please watch me whenever they are around. Right? Like, and they did, right? And I felt very confident that they had my back.
Yeah. Great points from both of you. This is so much fun. Thank you guys for being here.
Can I also just poke in Combat Barbie? Fun fact, in 1980, the Department of Defense partnered with Mattel to create Combat Barbie to get the women, to influence women to join the military. And can you imagine those IPRs, Mike? Can you imagine those meetings?
Especially with big hair like that.
Apparently the biggest issue, well, right. So the biggest issue they had was Mattel would not release a Barbie that could not have her hair combed.
Oh my
The
God.
military was like, she has to have a bun.
Funny.
So apparently what they settled on is this absolutely not at all military haircut. But this is amazing. Real combat Barbie. Of course, shortly thereafter, they made Ken. Do you think Ken outranked Barbie? Yes. Yes, you
Obviously,
did.
right?
Anyways, I've promoted her from Sergeant Barbie to Captain Barbie. I
go.
also have a chapter in my book called Combat Barbie, and I also have a t-shirt that I can sell to you ladies out there. Combat Barbie was like a slur that they used to throw around at the women that wanted to play soldier. And then we were just like, you know what? We love it. Let's roll.
Yeah.
The men in the army that are the most badass are expected to be specimens of human creation. Like, why not the women?
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we should get on the same page as far as let's talk about all the ways that you think the military is culty, both of you.
Yes, can I go first this time?
Yeah, you've got your whole, like, you have the
She has
10-point
checklists
model,
and-
and then all I'm going to talk about is Stephen Hassan's basic bite model. So you've got more to start with on this, so I think you should definitely lead it.
Yes. Okay. So I have a 10-part model that I don't have to list out because that will probably take too much time, but it includes all of the regular things. I say I'm coming at it from the aspect of group behavior. And the way I look at it is like, if you have all 10 of these things, congratulations, you are in a cult, right? That's why I have a t-shirt on right now that says, if it quacks like a cult. And when I was building this list and I was staring at it, I was like, and thinking of the military as a cult, that was when it hits me, right? So it's first of all, anything big, right? Catholic Church, Mormons, military, you have to look at the unit level. And with the military in particular, I realized like I have these 4 in red that don't always apply. But as soon as you deploy, the 4 in red, like isolation, like high exit costs, like really, really apply. And so that's why I believe, like, by definition, you are going to have a cultic experience. And knowing that helps us, right? As soon as I figured that out, I was like, I immediately understand more about things like soldier suicide, both while deployed and when coming back. Things like rape culture and things like how crazy it is to take people from a year in a cult and just throw them back in with their family with 7 days of show up so we can tell you not to shoot your wife and kids, And I also think it tells us a lot about planning for that cultic experience. Like, I would really love for every battalion commander in the military to have to meet with me so I can educate them on a little bit of the differences between like charisma and narcissism, right? Because all of a sudden, maybe we don't need to be putting every 25-year-old in command and then sending them off for a cultic experience. Okay, so that's my thing. Like, when you're deployed, when you're in a unit, and absolutely in this case, if the cult leader at the top, I feel like, is not a charismatic person, you just have a disappointing bureaucratic experience. If your cult leader at the top is a charismatic person, now you get to flip the coin. Are they a malignant narcissist or are they a transformational leader? Both, I think, are going to still be your cult experience. But even with all the stuff I went through, like, I'm still grateful for the team I served on under the transformational leader. Okay, so that's one part of the argument. And then I also think there are 5 things that I specifically push back on Stephen Hassan about that everybody has who joins the military that are parts of the cultic experience, which is you sign a black and white contract, right? You do not get to negotiate. You are signing away your life and you never know what you signed up for beforehand, right? It takes 6 months to fully onboard into the Children of God and the U.S. Army. And until you're at those 6 months, you don't know what you signed up for, which is also high entrance costs and high exit costs. I've added entrance costs to my model along with exit costs, because when you get through those 6 months and you realize what you really signed up for, you're also not that likely to want to quit because of what you just paid in entering, right? So entrance costs, high barriers to entry, become their own exit costs, right? Then you have the bait and switch, right? Which you see at cults all the time. It's all about you. It's all about you and what we can do for you until we get you. and then it's bait and switch. And this was the thing that convinced Stephen Hassan that the military is pretty culty. He calls me up and he said, I just found out your recruiters can lie to you. And I was like, yeah. The first thing they tell you at basic training is we don't care what your recruiter said. We own you now.
Whoa.
So there's the bait and switch. Okay. Then there is the identity breaking indoctrination. I like to say I'm the only cult scholar that doesn't give the military an exemption. I'm also the only one that I know of with regular military experience, other than Margaret Sanger, godmotheress of cult studies, who was an army psychologist and vehemently disagrees that the military is a cult. But you know what's interesting? You know who doesn't go through the identity breaking indoctrination part of basic training and onboarding into the U.S. Army? The psychologists.
Well, most of the medical field, right? Because they just come straight in.
Right. Doctors and lawyers. And I think part of that, though, is because if they put the psychiatrist through it, they would probably have to change some things under the do no harm sort of concept. So there's the identity breaking indoctrination. Then there is Mike, you brought up like, oh, we discuss things in the Army. Yes. But there's also a culture that I call shut up and sit down, lieutenant, shut up and sit down, private. When you're new, nobody wants to hear your opinion, whether critical, whether you're trying to understand anything. And we know from high control groups that once you've been in a regular company you work for, it's 6 months to a year until you no longer have the outside perspective. In a high demand, high control environment like that, it's 6 to 8 weeks. And as a former commandant of basic training once told me, there's a reason that the minimum amount of weeks for Army basic training is 8 weeks. And then there is the exit costs, right? The very high exit costs. And I would argue kind of a culture that is similar to shunning. It's not quite shunning, but it is definitely losing a lot. I was disappointed to actually see them treat a retiree who was retiring after spending all 20 of his years in the Army active during the 20-year war, and still kind of treat him like garbage. And why are you quitting the team when he was leaving? So those are all my things that I'm like, everybody in the military goes through. Different experiences may vary. How those negatively or positively impact people may vary. But that's the military's a cult argument.
Yeah, I like real quick before you go, Mike, I like, Danielle, that you said it's really a variable and that there could be a positive cult experience and a negative cult experience. And I think those nuances are really important to discuss because, of course, we're going to have people in the comments that are like, this is so disrespectful. How dare you call the military a cult? But I think having those nuanced approaches are really important in the larger scale when you zoom out and you really view everything from a bird's eye view.
Agreed. All right. So I'm going to put in, I don't have a 10-point model, but I just have various examples of where I could agree and then not necessarily disagree, but have probably a softer feel about the result of my time in it. So I know for me coming in, I had very little opportunity. And one thing that, though I was signing my life away in many, many ways to sign up for something, I wanted to sign up for something bigger than me. That may or may not be true with everybody. I know a lot of people see it as an opportunity because they don't have opportunity. So you can even have a socioeconomic issue where the military is, I think preying is too probably strong of a word, but it may not be. In some cases, you're getting a certain demographic of people that don't have other good options to come into the military, and it gives them resources, it gives them pay, it gives them opportunities. But I will always say that the military is going to get more out of you than you'll usually get out of the military. You will probably love the military more than the military will love you. Those are probably things because ultimately you are part of a large organization that is you're a cog in a large machine that is moving something forward, and it's very impersonal in a lot of ways. The personal touch comes at an individual level. It does not come necessarily from that organization. So will there be opportunities? Yes, there's certain things you come into the military. One thing that was different about Scientology and the military is the military takes you in, puts you through an aptitude test when you are recruited, it gives you at least a job field that you're going into and a military occupational specialty for the most part, where it's like, hey, this is what we're going to train you to hopefully do well. And I think that's something that the military does well, is they train their people to do a job at least a baseline level for the benefit of the military. In Scientology, oh my gosh, like we were doing different stuff all the time. What were you going to say, Daniela?
I just wanted to say, because one of the things you talked about in Scientology is how they only teach you what you want to know. And I thought this was funny with the military, because at least with the lieutenants, they're like, lieutenants are lieutenants are lieutenants. We don't care what skills you come in with. Like, we only want to look at what we taught you how to do. Completely agree with your education point. I just thought that was a funny parallel on what you said.
Well, they want you to fit into a slot. And at a certain point, when you are that new person, you have various degrees of new people. You have, new people that are very intelligent, new people that aren't as intelligent. But there is a lack of sometimes that new person. It is a little bit of the shut up and color, and you need to pay your dues before you really kind of have like equal stake in a lot of the decision making. A lot of that has to do with rank and experience, but a lot of it was people kind of passing along the trauma that they experienced when they were young. So it's like, I had a crappy childhood. I need you to have a crappy childhood too.
The Taylor Swift line, when you are young, they assume you know nothing. That always makes me think of being new in the military.
Yeah. I mean, when you are that new person, and there is a lot to learn, there's a lot of different aspects of the job that you have to figure out. But when I came in, like I was coming in with no financial history. Like I had no credit record. I had the first real paycheck I got. I was a private. When I got $840, I was like, this is more money than I've ever made in my entire life. And I thought I was rich. Now I know how. I think it's shameful we pay our privates that little, but anyway, I'm sure we pay them a little bit more now. But for me, it was a unique opportunity where it gave me something to do when I didn't have any opportunities, and it gave me an opportunity to. If one thing I love about the military is I was able to make progress and move up in rank and had more opportunities based off of how hard I worked. In Scientology, and that's the organization, no matter how hard I worked, I didn't have opportunities. And I was told what to do, and there was no real advancement for me other than just to drink more of the Kool-Aid and to be in favor of the leadership in this cult of Scientology, as opposed to in the military. If I worked hard, I've had very good leaders and I've had extremely bad leaders. And what's one thing that's funny is in the military, especially when you do a long period of time, like 20 years, we almost adopt a little bit of the mentality of, and this is very joking, of the Taliban and the way that they dealt with the global war on terror when we were in Afghanistan. They realized that if they just put up with us long enough, we're going to leave. And I say that a little tongue in cheek. We could probably have a whole conversation about the dumpster fire of Afghanistan and what we did right and what we didn't do right with that entire thing. But ultimately, if I have a bad leader, one thing that happens in the military is you have a constant change out of the officers in command positions, where if you have a guy that's like an excellent leader and you like, oh, I love working for this guy, get ready because he's leaving or she's leaving in somewhere between a year to 2 years max. And that person's gone and you're going to get in another unknown commodity. So that was something that I think it can be a positive when you have somebody that's crappy, because you can wait them out and you can just sort of like shut up and color, even when you're in a senior position, putting up with bad decisions and trying to kind of push things still in a positive direction. Or you get somebody who is a very, very inspirational leader and you're like, this is what we need more of. And I've found that I wish there was more of those, and there's not as many as I wish there was.
And let me say that, with your example of the counterinsurgency, we were so busy in the Army, we were so busy deifying General Petraeus for figuring out that it was a counterinsurgency that we didn't have the nobody's ever won a counterinsurgency before conversation. So yeah, that was like very interesting. But I do say, like, I agree with your thing of like, if I had to do it again, I would still join the military, because everything good that I had in my life, I was coming from almost nothing. And I was handed a career. I was given leadership training. I mean, these are a lot of the reasons I chose to join, because I would come out with not nothing.
Yeah. One thing I don't know that I have a good handle on, and I'm sure would have a lot more challenges, is a lot of the deployments that we had. We were in these locations for so long that almost a garrison sort of situation had gotten set up where it wasn't a rugged military experience, and it wasn't austere in many different ways. It was actually fairly well built up. So you had a lot of luxuries, and I don't know if that, in many ways, like the things like salsa night and the things that were for the individual. Well, did that help? Or like, I think that some of that helped with stress relief. But if we had and the other examples, like they were either shorter in duration or very, very worse, like where you have a more austere environment, would that change the stress level to a benefit or to a negative? I just don't know, because I didn't live through deployments that were extremely austere. So I don't know that I have a complete understanding of what would that look like if we got into a big war where we weren't having these like megafobs like we had in Afghanistan and Iraq, and it was different. I think it would probably be worse, but I just don't know for sure.
Yeah.
So I argue that it's worse. And one of my evidence points is we were not the only country in Afghanistan. There were 66 nations in the coalition fighting the war on terror. We were the only country who didn't allow their military to wear civilian clothes on their off time. Civilian clothes with obviously a lot of regulations and coverage requirements and whatever. But the simple fact, like on my first deployment, I went 9 months before going on R&R. So that for me as an intelligence person was 9 months without a full day off. And I literally putting on a t-shirt and jeans. And my exact thought was, oh, I feel like a human again.
Yeah, they're so light and like feel good.
We're the only military that doesn't do that. And we're definitely the military with the worst suicide rates. Also, I was the queen of salsa night.
Oh yeah, you were. Apparently in your book.
I posted a video recently of Lieutenant Mestanek salsa dancing.
Oh my gosh, yes. Everyone come to LA and we'll do a salsa night together, because salsa's my thing too. So,
but it's like, this is also an important thing in group motivation, and cult leaders know this, is like, you can't just have one giant goal. Right. And this is the chapter I'm actually writing in my book now, The Culting of America, where I talk about all the self-sacrifice that is constantly required. And for a system to be valid, it has to be self-sustaining. And I think this is a bigger, capitalism problem, but that means the organization sometimes has to lose in order for the individual to win. And we are not even at the point yet of the military realizing it's okay to be an individual. And that's something I very much think is changing as well. That the way we fight modern warfare is very different from the way we fought World War II. It's funny when people try to tease me about calling myself a spy. I'm like, my job is on the Spy Museum on the wall in DC. Spying just doesn't look like what it looked like in World War II. And I think one of the things about even just management science, right, is coming up in the industrial age, we assumed that everyone being an identical piece of the machine was the way to make the machine run more smoothly and therefore make your operations better. And I think what we are starting to understand in the information age, that everyone being different causes a little friction. That friction creates energy. That energy propels you farther. Right. And we're still not. The interesting thing is, like, one of my arguments is I don't think we have to do the same level of brainwashing, the same level of breaking you, all of these things for the current modern day profession of war. And actually, military doctrine agrees with me, because military doctrine, currently U.S. Army doctrine, is called mission command, coming away from unquestioning obedience, as many Western armies have been doing since World War II. Mission command, ironically, we took from the German, Auftragstaktik. And it is all about, like, we are no longer this like one command and control cell from up high. Because of technological advances, the general can no longer order every soldier when to shoot. And we also don't believe anymore that because I was told to do it, it's my job, is a defense for atrocities. So in many ways, we are requiring not unquestioning obedience in warfighting, but that's still how we're training. And this is similar to officers. You know, they say it's about leading a team, but every single part of your training is a dog eat dog, last man standing, who's going to win the individual competition.
Yeah.
So I've really noticed like one major issue that I've seen in the military is with regard to talent management and making an individual want to retention with regard to what is good for an individual. So what I mean about that is if you have somebody that's extremely good at something, the military should incentivize that person in order to keep them. Sometimes they'll offer bonuses, but a lot of times it's just quality of life things would be a real step in the right direction, putting the person geographically in the position that makes the most sense for them for where they want to live. There are some areas that not a lot of people want to go. So I do understand the sort of needs of the military with respect to where people get assigned. But I've always seen that usually the best officers, the leaders, they'll have a tendency of moving out before they'll stay in many respects, because they'll have opportunities on the outside and the military did not incentivize them to just keep them happy, to put them in the right spot. And when you lose, let's just say, take a pilot, for instance. Just to put somebody through flight school, if I was going to make a Tom Young just to make it so that he was a shitty brand new pilot that wasn't yet good at anything yet, I'm going to spend $2 million. By the time I make him good, I'm going to invest 20, 30, $40 million into his flight experience. To do everything possible to retain him and keep him happy would be in my best interests, as opposed to throwing a new guy at the problem that I now need to train up to that level. So that's an example from where I come from for aviation, but the same is true for Intel. You can't, there isn't a price that you can put on experience. And the military does not do a good job of retaining the right people in order to do that. And a lot of it has to do with this constant totem pole that I see, that people are always moving up. It's like we got everybody in the right position, we're doing great, and then before you know it, somebody's moving out, somebody's moving in, and you have this constant revolving door. And I get why it happens, but at the same time, from a corporate perspective, it's extremely inefficient. You never put the right people in the right spot for any length of time, and the inefficiency is massive. So in the cult, micromanagement was the same issue.
Yeah, it's inefficient, right? So for intelligence officers, it's $1 million to get me basically trained. We're the next most expensive, and they don't even lock us in for extra time. Now they lock pilots in for 10 years. But, you know, again, looking at the systemic level, right? How much does it cost to train a pilot? And yet still the organizational mentality, it broke my soul to watch the helicopter that Mike and my husband fly is worth $30 million. The 5 crew on that flight is only seen as worth $2.5 million, which is what the military will have to pay out if they are killed. And decisions are absolutely made based off spreadsheets like that. And they take a lot more care with pilots, because Americans care 44% more about a dead pilot than about anything else. And then therefore so does the leadership, right? If a helicopter is going down, you're going to be on the phone with the White House. So it's a big sort of deal. But what you were also saying, like, this is the story of why the military lost me, right? Which is when you're 18 or 22 years old, like, it's fine to go where they want to send you and live a, fly by the seat of your pants life for most people. By the time we're 25 and 30, it's like, no, I need a say. So, and for me personally, there were 2 very disappointing things. One was that I got stuck in aviation for 5 years. And so I was a pretty darn good aviation intelligence officer, but it was more than time for me to move. And it's such a stupid thing. Like, you want your intelligence to be specialized, not diversified. And it takes about 3 years for a non-pilot just to understand the briefs. And I was just like, I don't want to do this again. My only option was going to be to go to the special operations aviation, which at the time was even a worse environment for women. But, another almost silly example was I was making the decision to get out, and I got a message from headquarters, and they are desperate for Portuguese professors at West Point. because to be a Portuguese professor at West Point, you have to be an Army captain or major who speaks fluent Portuguese. Yes, they give you some training, but this would have been my dream job, right? I would drop everything to do this. And at the time they get you, they train you and lock you in. I would have been at 14 years. I would have decided to stay for sure. My only request was, I'm going to be married and I'm going to want to take my husband along with me. Conveniently, I outrank him. They definitely need aviation consultants, whatever, the counselors at West Point, right? Like this would have been too easy, as they like to say in the Army. Instead, I got, sorry, if you choose this path, you're going to have to consider yourself a geographical bachelor for 5 years.
Oh.
Well, no, that's ridiculous. That's ridiculous.
That's ridiculous. And they have an aviation unit there.
Yeah. And every couple of years, I get a desperate request to move to Florida and do Portuguese, either active duty or as a civilian for them. And I'm just like, sorry, like y'all could have kept me when you had me.
So I am loving all of this. One thing that I'm noticing, a through line between every single facet that we've talked about so far, is both of you want this need for putting back the individualism into the military. And instead of this group think, instead of this blindly following, you want them to be treated as individuals, and you feel like it would help raise the organization up and make a lot more sense. And that's interesting because when we talk about cults, oftentimes we talk about the dissolution of self, someone giving away their entire personality, becoming the personality of the cult, of the group, changing themselves. And so I feel like this is the through line of something that seems like it would help solve a lot of issues, is just seeing them as actual people instead of numbers or instead of this one whole group. Would you agree?
And actually understanding that needs of the Army and taking care of the individual go together. I just literally wrote this line in my book where I was like, the constant self-sacrifice is part of breaking you down, but it's also a poor operational choice. And in parentheses, I was literally like, we call sacrificing for the group. We just say needs of the Army. Like whenever we don't want to have to take care of the individual. But the interesting thing is taking care of the individual works. So they did this study at West Point in the 70s that showed that if you allowed people to choose and organizations to choose, just like an open market hiring system, you meet everybody's needs. There are actually people that want to live in Fort Polk or Fort Drum. I was one of the lieutenants requesting Fort Polk, for example, right? Yeah. So it does work, right? Like it does work to consider the needs of the individuals from a systemic level. It just takes longer and it takes understanding like systemic change. Mm-hmm. And also I think it just takes them being desperate. Like right now we're at the largest recruiting crisis ever. And so they're going to have to start finally changing the culture. And that makes me excited.
They are. And some of these things, and the military, anything government is a slow moving change. So we might want to see change immediately. The change that we want to see immediately, it might happen in 10 years, that kind of thing. So for instance, on the recruiting, they are starting to do an open market process where you're able to put in, hey, these are my first picks. They put the units and say, hey, this is the officers I want. And when they get to that 1-to-1 match, you're locked in for it. So there's a lot of opportunities, and they're trying to create a culture of, you do as good as you can. We'll evaluate you at this level. If you do your best, we'll try to do the best for you in terms of what you want. So they're trying to incentivize that in terms of the review process that you get. Sometimes, that's a lot of that is still very subjective in terms of, do you get along with the person that is reviewing you? Which I know Daniella will agree with me on this. You could do great things, but if you don't necessarily get along with your boss, you can still get a crappy review, even if you're doing good work. Now, the military, how it is different than a cult. It has a lot of the characteristics. It will make you somebody that is different from when you entered. Hopefully that's a good thing. I know a lot of people that leave military service, they look back and they miss it. And I think that when we are talking about veterans leaving, And that is a difference from a cult. Ultimately, the military wants to get rid of you when they've taken the best parts of your life. Like, we're going to take the best segment we can of you and get the most we can out of you. We'll give you a little bit in the process, but ultimately they're going to push you out the door. There is a crisis with veterans, and the VA is trying to deal with this. When they get rid of people, especially after they've been traumatized, what is the state of that individual at that point? Is that person able to reintegrate back into society? And there's examples of where people have, and where there's many, many examples where people have struggled very, very badly. But I have noticed that with military culture, it will imprint on you and it will be part of your life for the rest of your life. That's why you see these VFWs, these old guys rolling around with their Pearl Harbor hats on, going through the grocery store, and you're like, thank you for your service. And he's like, you know what I mean? Like, it's part of his DNA at that point, and it will be a part of your life because it was so important to you at that time. And most people I've seen that leave, they crave that same interaction. I know that's what I'm going to miss. I'm going to miss the clowns, not the circus, when I finally retire. When all the guys sitting around the lunch table telling stories about all the things that happened, telling the war stories, the things that were the good times, the bad times, all the fishing stories, so to speak. Those are that interaction is what people miss. But ultimately, the military will send you packing, where a cult wants to literally work you until the day you die. So that is a distinction. The point. Yeah, go ahead.
So, I'm sorry. Well, I just, I wanted to say like a couple things about that, which is there's so many things about the experience that make that true, right? Which one is something that bonds humans the tightest is going through really hard things together. And that's why people can't replicate that military experience just by bringing a bunch of ex-Rangers into the workplace and having them put you through a Tough Mudder. Also, this is true about PTSD, trauma, like the way we keep ourselves and other people going through traumatic experiences is by telling ourselves it's not that bad. And part of the experience of deconstructing our cult experience, our military experience, is going back when we are safe and saying, it actually was that bad. Yeah. And then one more little flag of the different experiences, right? So my Lieutenant Mafia read the book and they were like, hey, but you didn't tell like any of the fun stuff. You didn't talk about the goofing around, the this, the that, all the stuff Mike just mentioned, what I call the fuckery that helps you survive war. And my response was like, yeah, I wish I could have, right? I wish that was the story that I could have told and not had to talk about all the raping and toxic culture. So yeah, just that little thing on the experience where like one of the things I was constantly told when I was getting out was you're going to miss the camaraderie, which to me is a similar parallel to no one's going to love you on the outside. And my response often is like, what camaraderie? Like I definitely didn't experience the same level of camaraderie that Mike did because he fit the system better than me.
Sure.
Oh, I most definitely did. You were a square peg in a round hole in many, many ways. I mean, you're neurodivergent. I could not ever knit, even if you taught me to, let alone talk and do it at the same time. So you're a woman. You are neurodivergent. You are extremely independent. You're extremely outspoken. You do not fit the normal model of what the military wants combat Barbie to look like. Now, you would fit the right model. Like I think you even talked about a little bit in your book where you were considering going to like work for an agency or something. I could see you being successful doing something like that more so than just fitting into this like large machine cog sort of thing. If there was something that was, more niche, you would probably fit that better. But we're looking for like that G.I. Joe mentality. And when I left, I thought I gave up everything in my life. I literally just wanted to be G.I. Joe when I grew up, and I wanted to fly helicopters someday, and I didn't have the means to do so. So for me, it fit that better. I'm neurodivergent in a different way. I'm dyslexic. So for me, learning has always been very, very hard, and I trained myself through that, but it manifests itself as OCD. And, I am extremely focused on very narrow things, and I can get into the details, but I can also sit still. And that sounds, I'm not trying to be coy in saying that, but for me, this was the right path given my upbringing and circumstance. But that's the thing. Everyone is so uniquely different. You're going to have a million different experiences with it. Yeah. I don't think the process is set up to recognize all of those differences and be able to, like, we do the ASVAB test, like, which is the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. And it comes up with a very narrow list of what you're good at and what you're not good at. And then they offer you jobs as a result of it. So they need to expand on the process for how to put the right person in the right position and then incentivize them to do that. And we would save a lot of money and we would be more efficient if we did so. Just from my perspective on watching this thing fail miserably and then somewhat succeed in many ways.
Yeah.
Well, and even like when I was actively making the decision, like this is my decision point, I'm either committing for 20 years or I'm getting out. And my battalion commander gave us a OPD, Officer Professional Development talk called 4 Ways the Military Will Mismanage Your Career. And he did not realize this because I asked him later, but he used me for all 4 examples. Like he used other people, but he used me for all 4 examples. You know, Daniella speaks 3 languages. Why is she doing aviation intelligence in Afghanistan? So anyways, I think that's very true what you were saying. But here's another interesting similarity. Tom Young, also dyslexic. And people that are dyslexic tend to be really good with spatial awareness, which makes you a much better pilot, right? Like my husband doesn't have the risk, which a lot of pilots have, of getting disoriented and flying the wrong direction. Meanwhile, I am hyperlexic, which I just found out is a type of dyslexic. Part of why I knit is to keep the words on the page. But like I can't map to save my life. And so definitely different experiences.
So interesting. And before we go, there is one more thing that I wanted to talk about, because something that you mentioned, Mike, early on was that in some ways it's important that the military is like a cult because they need you to act a certain way. And so before we go, I just want to get your opinions on if you think the reasons the military is like a cult are actually necessary.
Yes and no. So given we have to, like many things in the society, the military has to adjust for the time that we find ourselves in. Mm-hmm. We cannot take a military model that worked in World War II or Vietnam or even Desert Storm or even the global war on terror in Afghanistan. We can't use that same model going forward. It's a completely different world we live in. So we have to change as the times change, and we have a vastly different civilian population we're trying to recruit. So you're going to have the gamer population, the TikTok population, all this sort of stuff. There's a lot of people that don't even qualify for military service based off of the model of those who are even able to physically or mentally go into service. So I think there's got to be a lot of adaptation and change as we go forward, because the mission is going to be very, very different. So we're in a technological age. There's going to still be need for ground combat and things of this nature, but there is going to be a much less of it. It is going to be a cyber war. It's going to be things that are very different. There's a lot of boundaries that are way different than they ever were before. So doctrine, we're both dusting off old stuff and then we're kind of trying to look for new stuff going forward. So yes, the military needs to have a process in order to take somebody, like we say in Scientology, raw meat, and make them into a member of the cult. Well, for the military, you have to take somebody that has the aspiration to be in that military service, and you have to put them through some sort of indoctrination model. But hopefully we do it in such a way that we capture the best parts of what they can provide the organization while also doing good by that person, so that we kind of are then releasing them back into the wild, into society as a functioning member of society. And we don't just send out broken bits.
Yeah.
So I think that's where we failed and how we need to do it differently. Now, I don't know how that all manifests itself. That's why you get big brain thinkers like Daniella to go and lecture people about how they're fucking up and how they could do it better. I'm just at the receiving end, as a warrant officer that's going to complain about all the things I want to see differently. So that would be my approach on it. I know that's probably not a clear answer to your question, but that's probably my best answer.
Yeah, that's great. Daniella?
Yeah, I mean, I also say yes and no, but mostly yes. Mostly it does need to be the way that it's going to be. It does have to change people, right? Like we are trying to, at the heart, take a normal human whose instinct is to run away from danger and train you to run toward it, right? Like we do have to do some personality modification. I get that. We don't have to do it based on 1940s science, right? We understand a lot more about even just human rationality, brainwashing, all of that stuff. we also, like, we just don't need to have things like you said, Mike, right? Like, there is no reason that I needed to lose 2 analysts and go shorthanded to Afghanistan because the Army decided they were too fat, when their literal job description was sit in a chair 12 hours a day and look at reports, right? Which, by the way, all of the agency analysts that they send over to us don't have to be that same level of physical fitness, right? So again, this goes into realizing that part of what we need to do just to keep our systems functional in general, I think, is humanize them a lot more, individualize them a lot more. One of the things I say about cults is, like, anyone promising you that their program works for everyone, AA, is conning you, right? Like, nothing works for every person. And when we want to have one answer solutions, that's why we have to go to these extreme, right? Like cult-like motivation tactics and environments. But I think just understanding more and having these conversations, right? So when people get frustrated with me and they're like, fine, it's fine. It's programming, but it has to be. I'm like, okay, then why are you getting mad at me for pointing it out? Another Stephen Hassan quote, if it's valid, it stands up to scrutiny. And a Daniella Messinek-Young quote, no person or organization is ever harmed by being compared to a cult, right? If you compare me to L. Ron Hubbard or Mike, like, we're going to come off golden and sparkling. So I think having this conversation, and then finally, the Army likes to call itself a good cult, and I would love to see that. I'm so excited that millennials are taking battalion command and Gen Z just respects each other so much more. You're not a good cult just because you say they are. You say you are, right? And my model includes constant self-sacrifice and exploitation of labor. So my very first questions to the military are, okay, if you are a good cult and you can do this at the unit level, what are you giving in aftercare to those soldiers who you had to ask to self-sacrifice in order to go accomplish your mission? Because I tell you what, if the military had to start paying hourly wages, they would shut down tonight. They'll shut down by the time I got to dinner, right? So, like, the exploitation of labor is there. My husband always says we need to have CultCon in the military, the way we have DEFCON. Like, okay, guys, I need you to ramp up to CultCon 7 for this mission. And we get that. We know how to play the game. Just drink the Kool-Aid is something we actually say in the military all the time when things are frustrating, right? Like, you just got to play the game. But when does the organization get back? When does the organization lose just a little bit so that the individual can win? Because that's like the homework that I have for the military if they want me to call them a good cult.
Amazing. This has been so great, and I'm bummed that we have to wrap it up. Thank you guys for sharing all of your thoughts and opinions. I think it was really enlightening. I enjoyed listening. I didn't have much to add, but I loved hearing both of you talk about your experiences. And if people want to find you, Mike, you have a YouTube channel. Your ad is Mike Brown 101. Daniella, you're on Instagram and TikTok. I know on Instagram your handle is Daniella M Young _ What's your Instagram or your TikTok handle?
The easiest way to find me, though, is just hashtag group behavior gal.
Perfect.
On Instagram or Twitter. Like, if you search that, you will find me. I will be the one knitting and talking about cults and the military. And I'm also, like, crowdsource writing my cult research book. So you get to, like, come be a part of that conversation with me.
Before we go real quick, I just need a sassy statement, your Linda Listen moment. Anything you'd like to say or something inspirational?
I would say, in terms of the thing that we could do better and listen to your people in terms of what they want to do to make your organization better. Even if they're the new guy, especially if they have something that might be outside of the box in terms of maybe we should try something that we haven't tried before, at least listen to what we have to say, take a look at that, and then try to take what that person says and see if you can utilize it so that we have more ideas and concepts going forward on how to approach things.
Yeah, I love it. Daniella, do you got one for us?
And I super agree with that. And to go back to something that Mike started with, if your people are not complaining, we always, in the Army, we call the soldiers Joe. And we say, like, Joe's not happy unless he's bitching. But to the leaders, I say, like, if you think you have an open door policy and you have more than 5 people that work for you and you're not getting pushback all the time, then you're not listening to your people, right? Like, so actually listening, actually changing, actually putting the individual experience sometimes and not just saying that we're going to, super important.
Yeah. Great. Amazing. Any final thoughts before we go?
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course.
Don't join cults. If it quacks like a cult, it might be one. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, and go read Daniella's book or listen to it. It's awesome. I'll put all the links in the description, guys, and the links to both of their episodes down below. If you want to support the podcast, liking, sharing, commenting, leaving those encouraging words are awesome. I love reading the comments. I know our guests love reading the comments as well. You can join us over on Patreon. We have some new patrons. Now that we're back in real time, I can talk about the patrons that joined during that time we had all the pre-recorded episodes. We have Stephanie, Don, Brett, and Cedar. Thank you so much for joining us over there. You can find us at patreon.com/cults2consciousness. You can get some of our merch at cults2consciousness.com. If you want to go to Costa Rica, we have only 4 spots left. It's coming up super quick, end of August. We're so excited to go. We already had our first Zoom meeting with everyone who's coming so far, and it's just awesome to get to know you guys. So if you want to sign up for that, the link's in the description. And I think that's it. If you enjoyed this episode, I'll link 2 more down here below that you can check out. And until next time, follow your highest excitement, be conscious, and be well.